Welcome back, everybody. Today we are just sat on the floor, as you do, with some plants. Today I'm, of course, talking about Margaret Thatcher. I'm straying from my usual kind of content just because I sort of feel like it, and because, I don't know, I don't want to just be sort of beating a dead horse and bringing up the same sort of things over and over and over again. So, in the meantime, while I'm kind of looking for some more good topics on the topic of body positivity and specifically fat acceptance, when I'm researching that, for now, enjoy this video. Baroness Margaret Hilda Thatcher was a woman who has been very firmly cemented in history, and although nearly 80% of my audience are American, I'm sure you all know who she is. Thatcher may have died in 2013, but she lives on, not only as an icon for conservative women, but also as a ghost of destruction that still haunts Britain. Her career was quite a vast one, actually, as she was not only Prime Minister, but she was a chemist, she graduated Oxford, she was a barrister, and she allegedly helped to formulate soft serve ice cream by inventing a stabilizer. On the other hand, she was a harbinger of destruction for many mining economies. She was a warmonger who ruined many lives while trying to revive the dead corpse of the British Empire, and an ardent homophobe who allowed gay men to die of HIV and AIDS because she didn't want to ruin her personal reputation. Thatcher was not only a very polarizing figure politically, but easily one of the most nuanced and fascinating figures in recent history.
To those waiting with bated breath for that favourite media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say. U-turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
I feel that this video is going to be exceptionally long for obvious reasons because there is so much to cover, so I'm not going to be going into immense detail on everything, and instead we'll just be giving an overview of some of her early life, her political career, the biggest scandals, the biggest controversies. Not only that, but I'm also going to be trying to demonstrate the lasting impacts of her policies, her decision making, and her impact on the culture. Margaret Thatcher, originally Roberts, was born on the 13th of October 1925 in Grantham, which makes her a Libra if anyone cares. She grew up in quite a normal, humble family, with a sister called Muriel, a stay-at-home mother, and a father who was a greengrocer and tobacconist. Nobody is born truly evil, and despite what she went on to do, I have a massive amount of admiration for a young Margaret Roberts. First of all, she reportedly saved up her pocket money to help a young Jewish girl escape the Nazi regime, and when she made the journey to England, her parents took her in. She was also a very high achiever in school with a scientific mind. She was awarded a scholarship to study at a grammar school, and she earned the title of head girl from 1942 to 43. Outside of school, she had a lot of hobbies. She liked playing piano, she liked reciting poetry, and she eventually volunteered as a fire watcher for the ARP during World War II. When she finished school, she received another scholarship, this time to Oxford University to study chemistry. She remarked on the fact that she was the first Prime Minister to have a science degree rather than the first woman Prime Minister. 3 years after graduating, she got another degree just for the fun of it. She got a degree in the Master of Arts. During the time of this degree, she was working for BX Plastics, but she was then rejected from ICI due to her personality. She was described as being headstrong, obstinate, and dangerously self-opinionated. Her days spent in the chemistry labs of Oxford would be some of her best, making great strides in the understanding of the antibiotic Gramicidin S and sparking a lifelong friendship with her mentor Dorothy Hodgkins. Hodgkins publicly disagreed with Thatcher's politics, but they stayed in contact for a very long time. It was in 1946 that the ever-ambitious Margaret became the head of the Oxford Conservative Association, making designs on a political career from very early on. Thatcher noted one book as being particularly significant in the development of her political ideology, The Road to Serfdom. This book promotes ideals and values that would fall under a very anarcho-capitalist umbrella today, or vaguely neoliberal. Social planning and government intervention are painted as dangerous and are said to lead to a totalitarian dictatorship which, if you ask me, is a bit of a slippery slope fallacy, but Margaret was loving it. In 1948, she travelled to the Llandudno Conservative Association conference as a representative of the University Graduate Conservative Association, also asserting herself as a high-ranking member of the Verming Club. Fitting name, Margaret, very fitting name. Thatcher at this point lived and breathed politics, with chemistry being a day job to her. At the age of just 24, she got incredibly lucky when a friend from her Oxford days introduced her to the Dartford Conservative Association, and after an unorthodox application process, she was accepted as an official Conservative Party candidate. It is at this point that she met her husband Dennis, having 2 children with him. Her career began to draw much public attention, not only due to her age and the fact that she was a woman, but also because, despite her slightly lacking public speaking skills, her answers were always exceptionally well prepared, and she was exceptionally self assured when delivering them.
Said at press conference the other day that he wanted the European Parliament to be the democratic body of the community, he wanted the Commission to be the executive, and he wanted the Council of Ministers to be the Senate. No, no, no.
She was known throughout her life as being very stubborn and didn't like taking no for an answer, so much so that she is still colloquially known as the Iron Lady. Her husband and parents financially supported her political campaigns, and she was also able to qualify as a barrister in 1953 with her husband's funding. By 1954, she was voted in as a Member of Parliament, gaining some media attention in 1961 by straying from the party's official position and voting in favour of caning children. Her premiership as Prime Minister was already in the works, as she had been discussed often as a possible candidate. Thatcher herself didn't believe this, stating that there will not be a woman Prime Minister in my lifetime, since the male population is too prejudiced. She was also one of the only Conservative MPs who would later go on to vote in favour of the decriminalisation of homosexuality and abortion, as well as a ban on hair coursing due to animal rights concerns. Don't give her too much credit though, because she was a strong supporter of the death penalty and voted against the relaxation of divorce laws. I must say, all this talk of prejudice aged pretty badly when we see the amount of classism and homophobia that she actively encouraged and codified into law. She also defended the far-right MP Enoch Powell's racist Rivers of Blood speech, still defending it in 1991.
In this country, in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man.
It's around this point that the worst of Maggie started to surface, and I've more or less run out of nice things to say. The year is 1970, and Thatcher is the new Education Secretary. As was typical with Margaret, she was not slow to act, and within days of arriving she had overturned Circular 1065, meaning that local authorities were now under no obligation to dissolve the tiered secondary school system. She then cut spending in education, abolishing an act that allowed 7 to 11-year-olds to access free milk at school. This in itself isn't too shocking, but her obstinance was. Thatcher was beginning to make one thing exceptionally clear. What Maggie wants, Maggie gets. Despite criticism and earning the name Margaret Thatcher Milk Snatcher, she told the Spectator that she would not be broken. If you'll pardon the pun, the milk debacle left a sour taste in people's mouths, and would be brought up every time that she decided to feign empathy or concern for the welfare of children. By 1975, she became the leader of the opposition. For my non-British viewers, or those who don't really like politics, this basically means that she's the leader of the second largest or most popular political party. Labour had won the election that year, and when the Tory leader Edward Heath, or Ted Heath as his friends called him, began to falter, she rose through the ranks and took his spot, promising a fresh start. It is safe to say that she did indeed usher in a new era, for better or for worse. In 1976, she doubled down on her anti-immigrant rhetoric, so much so that she attracted many votes from the far-right group National Front, If you don't know who they were one of the groups that destroyed the country a few months ago by burning down libraries. She spoke of backwards ideas such as the Great Replacement theory in her infamous 1978 Swamped interview with news agency World in Action.
People are really rather afraid that this country might be rather swamped by people with a different culture. And you know, the British character has done so much for democracy, for law, and done so much throughout the world, that if there's any fear that it might be swamped, people are going to react and be rather hostile to those coming in. So if you want good race relations, you've got to allay people's fears on numbers.
She also objected to Asian immigrants and wished to limit their numbers during her time in Parliament.
And I would just like to remember some words of St. Francis of Assisi, which I think are really just particularly apt at the moment. Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is error, may we bring truth. Where there is doubt, may we bring faith. And where there is despair, may we bring hope. And to all the British people, howsoever they voted, may I say this: now that the election is over, may we get together and strive to serve and strengthen the country of which we are so proud to be a part.
On the 4th of May 1979, Margaret Thatcher officially became the first female Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. To put things very bluntly, this is where shit really starts to hit the fan. Thatcher faced many problems during her time as Prime Minister, such as an already very bad reputation over the whole milk snatching thing, and a great deal of division within her own party already existed. Maggie is easily one of the most polarising figures in history and most definitely in British politics. Those who were still loyal to her predecessor Edward Heath expressed much criticism when it came to her policies, which have frequently been described as inhumane. And trust me, you're going to see why. Her economic policies were truly divisive, even outside of politics, as she dramatically worsened the poverty gap and the North-South divide. She and her Chancellor, Geoffrey Howe, created the perfect conditions for the rich to become richer and the poor to starve. Income taxes were lowered, meaning that high earners retained more of their wealth, and an increase in indirect taxes meant that regular people had to fill the economic black hole. They had to pay more for food and other necessities. Hey, that's just like it is right bloody now. She cut spending to public services such as housing, education, and other social services. In fact, her cuts to education were so extreme that she remains the only post-war Oxonian graduate Prime Minister to not receive an honorary doctorate from Oxford University. By 1980, her approval rating was a tiny 23%, the lowest that there had ever been for a Prime Minister. At this point in the Maggie story, it's time to start going into specifics because this is where things get messy.
The whole country is rightly concerned about security at home, about violence in the streets. We utterly condemn anyone and everyone who takes part in riots in Britain. Whoever these people are who riot, burn and murder, whoever they are organised by, there is no excuse, no justification whatsoever for such crime and vandalism.
In 1981, 2 years' worth of decreased social investment had created a great deal of deprivation and poverty, especially within cities. Unemployment had risen from 1.5 million to 2.5 million, and the fuel price crisis had hit, creating a recession that mostly affected the working classes. This was bad enough, but racial tensions made it even worse. Police had been given new powers that allowed them to perform stop and searches that disproportionately affected the black community. They were additionally allowed to interrogate people about their immigration status. Unemployment and homelessness also disproportionately affected people of colour, but especially black people. Society was becoming increasingly racist too, with hate crimes against black and Asian communities often going unseen, unheard, and unpunished. For example, on the 18th of January 1981, the New Cross fire was started with a petrol bomb, killing 13 black youths in what is widely accepted to be a racially motivated terror attack or hate crime. The public, the media, and the government showed massive indifference to these tragic deaths, sparking a march to raise awareness and protest. In the largest black rights march that the country had ever seen, 15,000 people marched to central London to demand justice. You'll probably remember Enoch Powell from earlier, the super racist one. Well, even though he'd got on the boot from the shadow cabinet, he was still a Tory MP and still had a massive influence. In March of 1981, he gave another fear-mongering speech, this time as an Ulster Unionist MP. He warned of a potential race war within the UK, throwing more wood onto the white supremacist fire. The recession and mass unemployment led to an increase in burglary and robbery, which of course was then blamed on people of colour, especially the black community. On the 6th of April, the Metropolitan Police launched Operation Swamp 81, which I personally think could be a reference to Thatcher's infamous swamped speech. This involved plainclothes police officers performing stop and searches, leading to the arrest of 118 predominantly black people. All of this compounded, leading to a series of riots in which black youth clashed with the police. Unfortunately, nothing has really changed here since then, as all of this is reminding me of the racist riots that swept the country in the August of this year. Misinformation, deprivation, Thatcherism within the government, and scaremongering led to violent riots in which hotels inhabited by asylum seekers were attacked. Black people were pulled from their cars and beaten, and children as young as 12 years old were engaging in violent clashes with the police. What's more, these extremist riots were motivated by racists claiming to be concerned parents, and the riots were only ever referred to as unrest. Unemployment and inflation remains high today due to similar economic policies following 14 years of Tory rule, and a pandemic, of course. Back to Thatcher's era, by 1982, unemployment had reached 3 million for the first time since the Depression in the 1930s, whereas inflation was going down and economic growth was increasing as the wealthy experienced better wages and lower taxes. Unemployment had risen so much that it triggered a mass exodus to London, in which young unemployed people believed that they could find work there. The opportunities, however, simply were non existent. So many of them ended up homeless, others were forced into prostitution to keep themselves alive. Serial killers such as Dennis Nielsen and Peter Sutcliffe took advantage of this, targeting sex workers and the homeless, knowing that the police wouldn't care. Thatcher attempted to explain away the consequences of her policies, making that age-old claim that, oh well, at least it's not socialism, that would be horrible. Guess what, Margaret? It's about to get a whole lot worse. Just as a small, tiny little precursor to this section, I'll reiterate that I'm not going to go over everything that led up to the Falklands War or everything that happened in it, but if you want to find out more, there is a wealth of information out there, and I recommend, if you're interested, go check some of that out. To sum things up very briefly, as a non historian, the British Empire owned some islands near Argentina, and a new regime in Argentina wanted to drill for oil there, and Maggie wasn't having any of it. Many of the citizens of the Falkland Islands wished to remain under British sovereignty, but diplomatic relationships between Britain and Argentina completely fell apart. The war itself was never actually declared by either side and only lasted 74 days, with the death toll being relatively low. It wasn't the war itself that I'd like to focus on, but rather the aftermath. The 1982 war came at the perfect time for Thatcher as her ratings were on the floor, but it wasn't good for the soldiers who came back traumatised and destitute. Thatcher's Ministry of Defence was repeatedly accused of systemic failures, which was and pretty much still is standard for everything within this amazing country. It's been said that the soldiers were in no way prepared or trained for the psychological horrors of war. There was no real plan to deal with the aftermath either. The government and military ignore the fact that the soldiers who had fought in active duty had far higher rates of depression, substance use problems, social withdrawal, and unemployment. Obviously, PTSD was a massive problem too, and some came back with personality disorders that they stayed with for their whole lives. It is also believed that the number of British soldiers who died in combat is actually smaller than the number who took their own lives within 20 years of the war, with 255 war deaths and 264 self exits. Decline in social spending alongside mass unemployment only worsened this crisis amongst veterans, leaving many of them with untreated mental illness and very little money. Anyone who knows a veteran will likely have heard countless horror stories from the war itself, and even more from afterwards. For example, I once knew a man who was left penniless and suffering from PTSD after the war, having lost his job. The search for employment, especially in a rural area, was so tough, and his mental health had deteriorated so much that even 20 years later he was struggling to keep a roof over his family's heads, having to sell the medals he earned in that war to buy Christmas presents. There was no apology for any of this until 2007. After the war had ended and the economy had started to pick up slightly, the Tories went right back to a general election. Riding on the high of a military victory, Margaret miraculously retained her position as Prime Minister after 4 years of countrywide destruction and discontent. The wealthy were loving life, and Conservatives were giddy at the thought of having destroyed socialism once and for all. But the working class, well, they were not having the best time. Our voting system is a first past the post voting system, and it allowed Maggie to return to her historic position, although not being very popular with people. She returned and privatised everything to make life even more shit. I'm sure that plenty of you will have heard or seen the saying, Reagan and Thatcher have probably privatised hell by now, and it's quite easy to see how that phrase came about. Hey, you, British citizen, have you ever wondered why no stretch of river in England is considered in good ecological health? Or why people are frequently told, hey, please don't drink tap water, you might get sick? I have the answer. Margaret privatised all the water companies. Natural resources used to be state owned and controlled until Maggie won the 1983 election and sold them all off to greedy profiteers. She sold off water, council housing, rail and bus services, electricity, gas, mining, and basically everything else that's important for basic survival in a techno-industrial society. Notice how all of those things are now significantly worse than they were before? People then started to experience, well, basically exactly what we do now, with their bills skyrocketing, food doubling or tripling in price, and fuel being so expensive that hundreds of thousands had to and still have to choose between starving or freezing to death. Oh well, at least it's not socialism. However bad this might be, just know that it's about to get worse again.
Mr. Chairman, what we have seen in the past few weeks is not picketing at all. It is an attempt by force to prevent others from doing what they have a right to do.
Trade unions were attacked by the government because workers' rights are bad, and this was just one final slap in the face to the working class, particularly in the north. The south of England has historically been more privileged than the north in a number of ways, including better public services, better healthcare, less pollution, higher average salaries, and an overall better quality of life. The Tory party is a large part of the growing divide, investing more into the south and allowing deprivation elsewhere. If you live in the north of England, specifically in Yorkshire where I live, you're more likely than anyone else in the country to get cancer, experience domestic violence, die younger, get subpar education which will then affect your career options for the rest of your life. In 1964, the government also secretly tested bioweapons on us all, so that's fantastic too. However, one of the biggest screw the North moments came from Thatcher herself in 1984, in which she not only tried to crush workers' unions, but actively destroyed local economies that she claimed to be in favour of by closing down many, many coal mines.
The horses are the most feared weapon in the police armoury on the picket line, and they're very effective.
Again, I will not be giving a full series of events here for the sake of brevity, and I will just be giving an overview of the miners' strikes and the lasting effects of the pit closures. The miners' strikes lasted from the 6th of March 1984 and lasted nearly a full year, by the way, drawing to a close on the 3rd of March 1985. Back in 1981, it was becoming clear that the mining industry was under threat, so the Yorkshire area of the National Union of Mine Workers, NUM, voted to strike over any potential colliery closure due to them being deemed uneconomic. At first, this led to a 2-week strike over the closure of the Orgreave Colliery, and this was enough to scare the government. As it happened, they were right in thinking that their livelihoods were under attack. The government actually had plans to close down a further 23 pits. This was immediately stopped by the threat of a national strike, since England needed at least 6 months' worth of coal stock to prevent an economic collapse. In response to this, the government offered a pay rise which was settled at 9.3% by the NUM. However, pit closures did still occur, and the National Coal Board cut 41,000 jobs, trying to mitigate the impact by transferring some people to different mines. Tensions between the NUM and the government were still very high, and in January of 1982, the NUM put a national strike to vote. The majority of union members decided against a strike, but the following year, a ban on overtime was implemented. Although things seemed calm for now, Margaret was already beginning to prepare for the worst that the NUM and its leader Arthur Scargill could possibly give. She had started to come up with defence strategies with the police, converted power plants to burn oil instead of coal, and set up a high-level planning committee. Most significantly, she appointed Ian McGregor to the National Coal Board in 1983. This was a man who had a reputation similar to Margaret's. He did not and would not back down. He had revolutionized the British Steel Corporation and made it one of the most efficient steel companies in Europe, when it was formerly one of the worst, coming at the cost of half the workforce. It was feared that he would implement the same tactics when it came to the coal industry, which would be catastrophic to the many communities in the north of England, Scotland, and Wales that were almost entirely reliant on coal mining. It was on the 6th of March 1984 that these fears became a reality, as it was announced that 20 collieries would be closed, putting an estimated 20,000 men out of work. Scargill had warned that the government would close down over 70 pits, but nobody would know for certain until 30 years later when the true plan was made public knowledge. Scargill wasn't far off the mark at all, since 75 mines were set to close within 3 years. It was on this day that a number of small-scale and unofficial strikes began, predominantly in and around Yorkshire, with NUM support officially being declared by Scargill 6 days later. After this, a snowball effect occurred as more and more miners got involved in the strikes, with their wives going out and striking as well. Strikes, on occasion, did turn violent, in which police clashed with the miners and even their wives, which is questionable. 1984 wasn't really Maggie's year, because not only did she have to deal with the strikes, but she was nearly assassinated by the IRA. I must say, although her policies were cruel and she behaved in ways that painted her as completely devoid of any human empathy, I do admire her ability to stick to her guns and not be intimidated by all of the men, strikers, terrorists, anyone really, anyone who challenged her. She was not intimidated, and I respect that. The strikes grew to an end because she essentially starved them out. The striking miners were so desperate to get back to work because they could no longer afford to put food on the table. The NUM had also started to falter and break down in places, with group tensions rising and breakaway groups forming. Miners who were able to return to the pits did, but the trouble was not over yet. Mining communities have historically been very supportive and close-knit due to the risky nature of the job, but they were torn apart by hostility towards miners who choose not to strike. Unemployment and poverty further added to this discontent, as did growing anti-northern and anti-working class sentiments. Thatcher herself sowed these seeds, likening miners on strike to Argentine forces in the Falklands War. The number of pits that got closed down is reported to be double that of the proposed 75. 150 pits were shut, and the thing is, not all of them were even losing money. Mining was a profession that was often passed down families, with young men following in their father's footsteps and becoming miners too. When this was no longer an option, young people simply didn't know what to do anymore, and failing local economies led to the closure of other businesses, which only worsened the deprivation. Little was invested, and the austerity that came with the following decades near enough finished them off. Well-paying jobs are still only accessible to many via commuting into cities, and poor transport infrastructure doesn't exactly make this any easier. Hey Maggie, thanks for privatising all of the transport! It was inevitable that coal would eventually decline in demand, but these pit closures were too much, too soon. Thatcherites to this day will see this as a great move, as it did benefit the overall economy and allowed some new businesses to establish themselves. Let's just say it was a good time to be wealthy in 1985, a decrease in social spending and lower taxes for high earners, but after all, when you think about it, was this really worth the human cost? The damage done to unions has been pretty permanent too, and they now have little power in the UK, whereas the benefits have still not stuck around all that much, as inflation is spiralling out of control here and growth is slowing, sometimes getting below zero.
But it's the plight of individual boys and girls which worries me most. Too often, our children don't get the education they need, the education they deserve. Children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay. All of those children are being cheated of a sound start in life. Yes, cheated.
We're now finally in the last stretch of this long video, as the year is 1988, and within 2 years our protagonist ends her premiership as the longest serving Prime Minister of the 20th century. Thatcher had a fairly rocky relationship with the gay community, voting for the legalisation of homosexuality, but then perpetuating homophobia by spreading the gay panic mass hysteria. By the 1980s, people were becoming more aware of being gay, and there were more and more openly gay celebrities and politicians who worked to destigmatize it after centuries of persecution. The general public was not quite so willing to accept or tolerate, however, and homophobia was extremely common. What's more, the AIDS crisis had broken out and disproportionately affected the gay community, leading to even more stigma. The real tipping point came for our Maggie in 1986 when the children's book Jenny Lives with Erica Martin was reported on by the Islington Gazette, which sparked mass homophobic protests. And they say people are too sensitive now. In the general election the following year, this became political ammunition, with the gay community being demonised in order to make the slightly less homophobic Labour Party look worse to voters. Homosexuality was painted not only as a choice, but as a moral failing, a perversion, and a sickness. Gay men in particular were treated very similarly to child predators and accused of intentionally manipulating kids to choose to become gay. Wow, that sounds rational. One thing led to another, and Section 28 had been passed. The so-called promotion of homosexuality was now illegal. Moral bankruptcy aside, the legislation was poor due to how exceptionally vague it was. There was no specific definition of the word promote, meaning that it could be applied willy-nilly as an excuse for systemic homophobia, even in medical settings. If you're lost here, just think about how the UK treats transgender and transsexual people now. Just like that. Moral panic and all. This law was used to shut down LGBT centres, ban leaflets on safe sex and AIDS prevention, and stop teachers from intervening in events of homophobic bullying. Increased stigma around being LGBT worsened collective mental and economic well-being for the members of this minority group. You might think that luckily this is over now, but not really, because Section 28 and the stigma that came with it has left a permanent stain on multiple generations. Section 28 additionally went on to normalise and justify anti-LGBT discrimination, with the law only being changed in 2000 in Scotland and 2003 in the rest of the UK. Thatcher once again pulled that age-old excuse of, "We're just protecting children." Wow! Where have I heard that one before? Well, guess what? This is the same woman who, of course, did the whole milk snatching thing. She was also best friends with Jimmy Savile, and she also massively underfunded health and social care, especially for kids. So, funny how her concern for children is quite so fickle. Over the next couple of years, the Iron Lady's iron will had very much run its course, eventually dividing her own party so much that she had little in the way of support.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're leaving Downing Street for the last time after 11 and a half wonderful years, and we're very happy that we leave the United Kingdom in a very, very much better state than when we came here 11 and a half years ago.
She stepped down on the 28th of November 1990 in tears. She remained in the House of Commons for a further 3 years, stepping down once and for all in 2003 due to her declining health and age. She was 77, by the way. By 2005, she was revealed to be suffering with the advanced stages of dementia, and in 2013, she passed away of a stroke at the age of 87. In the Ritz, naturally. Within days of her death, the song Ding Dong the Witch is Dead rose to number 2 in the charts. Make of that what you will. Thatcher left behind a legacy that will likely never be challenged by anybody. She was determined, she was intelligent, ambitious, unswayable, and a trailblazer in every sense of the word. She was a scientist, a barrister, a politician, a mother, a wife, and a friend to many. The Thatcherism that she pioneered and instated changed politics permanently, revolutionising Labour to the point that it is still, to this day, just Tory but the red version. She changed the entire world too. Since her, more and more women have been taking up high level positions, very powerful positions, especially in politics. To some, she was the best PM that the country had ever seen, to others, the worst. She smashed this country to the ground to rebuild it, showing an immense level of grit and strength. In the end, her own stubbornness was what ended her political career, and looking back at the ongoing human cost of her policies, she probably should have been for turning.
The ladies not for turning.
Thank you for watching my video. I hope you all enjoyed it very much. It's actually nowhere near as long as I thought it would be. I tried to kind of summarize things because, yeah, this has already taken many days of research, editing, scripting, everything. I hope you liked the location and just in general, hope you enjoyed everything. And again, I'm open to exploring a number of different topics. So if there's anything more that you want to see, just let me know. I will have a look. I'll look into it. I might do a video. As always, thank you and goodbye.